Hi, everyone. This is Howie Ree with Duke University, and this is from Dorm Room to Startup with Courtney Bell, who is the co-founder and CEO of Ungraded Produce. Thanks for joining us, Courtney.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Courtney started at Duke as an undergrad in 2013 and graduated in 2017. And the point of this web series is to focus very specifically on the time period when a founder was a student in college. I see a lot of entrepreneurship talks online that talk about student founders, but actually kind of gloss over that difficult period when they were students, and the things that they had to go through and the activities that they were involved in. So it's meant to give a fuller picture of what it's like to be a founder as an undergrad in college. So Courtney, tell us a little bit about yourself, first year and second year. What were some things that you were involved in, and what'd you study? Things like that.
Yeah, so I came to Duke with a real passion for environmental science and food sustainability. I read a lot of like Michael Pollan books and other, food systems books in high school and knew I wanted to focus on that in college. So I came in prepared to study environmental science. And all of it, I'm not someone who likes to get overly involved in things. So I kept the extracurriculars pretty light, but I did club basketball my freshman fall and did environmental alliance my freshman year. And then I joined sorority Chi Omega when I was a freshman as well. And that sort of became, the organization I was like mostly committed to. And then additionally, my sophomore year, I volunteered as a research assistant in my professor's lab. So I did a lot of environmental related things. And also was still in my sorority.
Cool. And so talk about how the seed idea for Ungraded Produce began. And actually, first tell us, what does Ungraded Produce do?
Yeah, so Ungraded Produce is a subscription-based produce delivery service that has two goals. One is to fight food waste, and the second is to make fresh produce more accessible. And we fight food waste by sourcing produce that isn't bad. It's really yummy and fresh. It's just normally getting left in the field or getting thrown out before it reaches a supermarket because it's in excess or ugly, meaning that it's maybe a little misshapen or too big or too small, or has some minor discoloration, but that doesn't affect quality usually. But supermarkets are so strict that they would reject it normally. So we source that stuff, and because we're buying products that would normally go unsold, we can get them at a discount, and then we can sell them at a discount. So we deliver boxes of fresh produce to people's homes for prices that are about 30% cheaper than what you could get at a Harris Teeter or Kroger type of a supermarket. So it makes it easier to eat fresh produce and more affordable.
Cool. And so let's talk about the start of Ungraded Produce, and how did the idea come about, and what were some of the first steps you had to go through?
Yeah, so Ungraded Produce came a thing the summer after my sophomore year. I was up in Detroit just at a regular corporate internship, and I was a little bored and discouraged because I had this real passion for the environment and didn't know how I was going to, carve out a path and, post-grad. And about a month in, a friend of mine from my sorority texted me that she kind of had this idea. She had been interning for the mayor of Durham that summer and working on a poverty reduction initiative. And she was interacting a lot with the low-income communities in Durham and learned that there was a high demand for fresh produce, but most people in those communities didn't have access to it because they were surrounded by like bodegas and fast food restaurants, and maybe lacked transportation to go to a supermarket located outside of their neighborhood. So she wanted to do something about that. At the same time, she knew a little bit about ugly produce, which was starting to become popular because French supermarkets were introducing it into their stores and bringing attention to it. So she kind of put two and two together and realized that there may be an opportunity to divert ugly produce to low-income consumers here in North Carolina. So because of my background in environmental science and food, she reached out to me with the initial idea and said, hey, would you like to join me on this? And I was like, yes, please sign me up. So we set out from the desk of our internships that summer, me in Detroit, her in Durham, and just started to lay the groundwork for what eventually became Ungraded Produce. And it took us almost a year and a half before we made our first delivery. But we spent that time going from no, background of the business or anything to, starting a full business.
So I met you, I think, in August of that summer, and summer after your sophomore year. And I remember that you had the idea, and I think that one of the things that we said in the meeting was like, all right, like let's get going and let's start to make deliveries happen. And I was really impressed with you because I think like a month later, you had started collecting produce, you had a refrigeration unit, you had started to sign up, I forget how many at that point, maybe 5 to 10 initial customers. And like you just made so much progress in such a short amount of time. So just talk about that beginning stage there, the first couple months when you were really on the ground. Like, how did you make so much happen in such a short period of time?
Yeah. And I've always kind of let you give me more credit than I deserve, because when you met us, we were very close to actually launching. It had taken over a year to get to that point. So that summer that we came up with our idea, we were just researching and emailing people. I started to meet with a few people in Detroit who were involved in food banks and, startups, and just to learn about things. And then junior year, I was abroad, but we worked with the Duke Startup Clinic on our legal documents. And it wasn't until the spring that we started to try to reach out to farms and, figure out how we could launch a trial period at the start of our senior year. And we were having a lot of difficulty connecting with people. It was just a busy time of year, and we didn't really have contacts. There's not a lot of information online about farmers. And so we were struggling in that area. And additionally, we were finding that there was no cold storage space available, and we couldn't run a company unless we had access to coolers. So it was sort of a little stressful. And the summer after my junior year, I was here working on another internship in Durham, but spending my free time focusing on securing the resources to launch. And I was able to find cold storage space. It was sort of a being at the right place in the right time kind of situation. And it wasn't until maybe like halfway through the summer that we got our first farm. So when I met you in August, leading up to my senior year, I had like 1 or 2 farms that, I was going to work with. We had cold storage space, but now we needed to find customers. And so, it was like 2 weeks before school started. So all that we did at that point was we posted on our sorority Facebook page. And I think you had emailed Duke, the Durham alumni network, to see if anyone was interested. So through that, you got 15 people signed up, and set out at the beginning of the year with really no clue what we were doing, and started making deliveries to them out of the trunk of my car.
Got it. Okay, so I messed up the timing in my mind. So summer after sophomore year, you had the idea and you started working on it, and then you had a whole year to develop it more. And then you and I met summer after junior year, so August before senior year. Well, I still give you though a ton of credit though, August to September of that year, because you're making it sound like it wasn't maybe as hard as it was, but from my perspective, it was a ton of progress from August to September, even still. So
appreciate that.
So talk to me about senior year. So things progress. You're trying to balance schoolwork and senior year. So whatever else that entailed for you. How did you do that while you were doing all this work? And also just characterize maybe how much work did it take to do this each week?
Yeah, I think for me, what was really challenging was that things kind of went from like 25 to 100% really fast. So our first semester when I was back, we were the entire year, still to this day, I feel like we're learning as we go. There was no people out there who could, give us the exact information we needed to run a fruit and vegetable delivery service. So, our first semester, we started out with these 15 customers, most of whom were on campus and lived in our sorority house even. And we delivered every other week on the weekends. We offered only one product, and we worked with these 2 farms, both of which were like in the triangle. So we didn't have far to go ever to pick up from them. So like it was pretty low key that first semester. On a delivery week where we actually had to pack boxes and deliver them too, I'd say we spent no more than 12 hours the entire week on business related matters. On an off week, 5 or so, because maybe I would be trying to reach out to farms or whatever. But at that point, we didn't know enough to really plan for the future. So we were just sort of feeling it out. So we had an article in the Chronicle, and just through a little word of mouth, like developed a bit of a wait list for our spring semester subscription. So, once the spring semester came around and we were signing new people up, all of a sudden we had about 60 people who were getting our products, and we started to offer some different boxes, and we're working with other suppliers who were located in various locations. So it all of a sudden out of nowhere became very demanding because we were still doing this all entirely around our school schedule. And I only took 3 classes senior year, but I still found myself now spending all of my time, if it wasn't working in the business, on the business. And I had to meet some milestones from Melissa and Doug that I didn't know how to do, and that kind of stressed me out. So a lot of time maybe was wasted attempting to do things such as like acquiring customers, but that time also was spent wisely because I eventually did acquire those customers for the summer when we graduated. So it was hectic to say the least.
Yep. And talk a little bit about the decision to do this full time. So you've done it now full time for right now it's October 2018. So for a year and a half, I think, right? And talk about that decision. So, at that point, I'm sure that most of your friends had full-time offers or were thinking of going to grad school and things like that. And how did that go in terms of the decision to say, I'm going to stick with this and do it full-time?
Yeah, it was really stressful because, well, first of all, my business partner already had sort of committed before we even came up with the idea to go work on Wall Street for a little while afterwards. So I knew that it was just going to be me running the show for a while. So there was no like news there, but it was really stressful for me to make that decision because, you start senior year and people are starting to look for jobs if they haven't already began like the consulting, thing and whatnot. So, my mom, was kind of sending me some like Indeed stuff and this and that. And I'm looking through it. And as an environmental science major, I really found there was nothing that I could do at this point right out of college that wasn't something that maybe someone who had, just a high school background could do. So there was like a big gap between you needed a high school background and you needed 5 years of experience and a master's degree in environmental science to work like, certain jobs. And so I was just like, couldn't even find anything to begin with. But I already sort of knew like I wanted to run this full time and just felt a little bit of pressure from like receiving job applications to look at. So in early October, I talked to my parents, and it was really tough because we had made a single delivery at that point to 15 customers, but I knew that I couldn't keep doing the job search thing. It was just going to stress me out. So I talked to them and said, like, I know that you guys mentioned that, like, I'm probably going to run this after college and we're going to see how it goes, but like, can I have your blessing now so that we can stop this whole job search charade? And they gave me their blessing. So it was a bit of a tough decision because we'd made one delivery at that point, but it definitely like cleared my mind to some degree. So that was nice. And then it got a little stressful again towards the end of senior year when things started to become a little more real, and we're doing this now. But I was lucky to have a really supportive family and come from a family of a lot of self-starters.
That's great. Can you tell us, let's start to characterize a little bit. So spring semester, you say it's like very hectic and, you're spending almost all your free time doing it and you're trying to cultivate sales and whatnot. Can you just help characterize that a little bit more? Give us a sense as to how many deliveries were you making a week during spring semester? And just talk a little bit about maybe some of the, I don't know if there's like a story talking about like how you had to like, study for a test and then like go, pack, boxes for 3 hours and then wake up at, 8 a.m. the next morning to deliver for 8 hours. But just to give us a little bit more sense as to what that was like.
Yeah. So, we did do different like weekly cycles of deliveries. We had a fruit box we were testing out, and we were mostly serving students on campus at that point. So we had one weekend out of a 2-week cycle where we were just mostly delivering on campus, and that was a lighter week and it was easier. And then we had our other week where we were delivering, our mixed boxes, and at this point we had a fair number of people who lived off campus, but everywhere, Raleigh and Cary and stuff. So the weekends became really crazy. In terms of deliveries, how a week looked was we would start to reach out to our suppliers on like Monday and gather information about what they had. We worked with some people who didn't necessarily know what they would have until they brought it to a big open market. So we would wake up at Thursday at like 6:30 and leave to go to this big market in Raleigh and try to find stuff, bring it back to our cooler, and then go to classes. And same kind of on Friday, depending on who we were working with. We may have to drive all the way out to like Wilson, North Carolina or whatever, just to get small quantities of produce. So that was pretty hectic. And then we'd pack for maybe, I don't know, 3 to 5 hours. And then we come back, 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday and make the deliveries. And when we were serving the off-campus customer base, I was having to drive like 7 hours before I'd go back and like start to do my homework. And usually like not on much sleep. I usually didn't even like eat very much that day because I just wanted to get it all done. So I was always really exhausted. And then you'd have to go back and like do some work and figure your life out and then repeat the following week. And so then I had classes, and you spent time during classes. I was answering emails. I was barely paying attention anymore. And during my free time, I was spending time trying to figure out how to grow this business. So it became really exhausting. But, there were days where I'd only get 3 hours of sleep because I had a little bit of insomnia, and, I'd still have to get up at 6 a.m. to go to these markets. Just couldn't, not do it. So it did become really hard, that it was all on you. And if anything in your life came up, it was too bad, because if you didn't do it, the business wouldn't operate. So that became a lot. And, that was hard for me to sort of deal with.
Yeah, that is quite a bit, on top of the regular stress of just being in college. Talk a little bit more about some of these transactions. I'm just trying to imagine you negotiating with a farmer. Can you give it? Obviously, things have changed a little bit now, a year and a half or 2 years later. But back then, that spring semester, like, what were you buying? Was it fruit or vegetables? What kinds of fruit or vegetables? And like, what would be the deal? You would say, would you give them like, $50 in cash, $300 in cash, and would you take 100 pounds of so just talk about like what a typical deal might look like.
Well, I mean, we would just ask them what they had and essentially pay them what they told us the price was. We had a check, so we wrote them. It was really unstructured. That year we didn't have like spreadsheets that we used really to properly plan the orders and stuff. So like we had this idea of we need 50 pounds of this vegetable and 20 pounds of this vegetable, and we'd go, and whether it was we placed an order with a supplier or had to go just buy it on the spot, we would go based on that. And the problem is we also really didn't understand quality control at that point, and the fact that like you may get 50 pounds of zucchini and they're all 2 pounds each, and then you don't have enough zucchini to give 30 customers, plus some of them are moldy and you have to get rid of them. And, there was a lot of that. So, we didn't necessarily send out boxes that were all uniform in makeup, because we just sort of were like, let's just put whatever we have in these boxes. And that means certain people got like boxes full of like starches, and, it was just not well composed. We just really, didn't know what we were doing. So, it was just sort of a chaos. But we just sort of went with the flow and bought what we could, and came out of it more prepared to place well-informed orders once I graduated.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about how much you were charging that spring semester?
Yeah. So our boxes were definitely less expensive than they are now, because we had no idea what they're going to cost. Our 5-pound box was like $8.50. Our 10-pound box was like $14. And on top of that, delivery was free. And because we were just getting what we could, we were probably paying at least $1 per pound for produce on average. So not sustainable at all. But we just sort of looked at maybe other competitors or just like what we thought was reasonable at the time and slapped a price on our products. And it wasn't until after we graduated and, started to run things a little bit more at scale and recognize more of what those costs would be that we could make a more informed decision of what the prices should be.
Cool. So then let's talk a little bit about the Melissa and Doug Entrepreneurs Program. So you applied for it senior year January, and then you got in February. And just talk a little bit about what the program was like, and maybe describe for folks, what the program is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so Melissa and Doug Entrepreneurs is sort of a student group for students that either have startups or have an idea for a startup or anywhere in between. And it's a sort of network where you meet on a regular basis with people like Howie and other more experienced entrepreneurs who serve as mentors, and you work on all different things, whether it's you're just having a problem and you're discussing it with the group, or like as the program progressed, we worked more on a pitch for a demo days that we had at the end of the year. And it was just like a nice community for me, more than anything. When I went to the meetings that we had each week, with the rare exception, I just kind of sat back and listened. And part of it was I was just like, it was too much going on. And part of it also was that, all of my questions at this point were like produce questions, and maybe people there couldn't give me answers, and that's okay. But it was great to hear other people ask questions. It sort of got me thinking about, okay, what am I not thinking about right now? Because I don't think like an average, entrepreneur. I just think about produce. So that was helpful, being in that community. And then as when I was in the startup challenge that fall, it was also really great to have like the mentors like you and Jake and Tati who could help me with my pitch a little bit. You gave me feedback, which was really great. So overall, I'd say it was like a really great experience.
Cool. And talk a little bit about some of the stuff you learned either through the program or around that time frame of end of senior year. Like, what were some of the mistakes that you made that in hindsight you can say like, oh, okay, that was a mistake? Obviously with any startup there are so many, but like, what were some of the key ones that you've really had to change over time?
Yeah. I think the mistakes that I made to some degree were a little bit more like, they were a little bit more like because of the industry I'm in or whatever. But I think the biggest mistake that I made looking back is that I had no idea how to, for instance, reach the milestone we'd set for the program and get 50 new customers signed up for the summer. To me, that felt like an impossible task, considering that most of our customers were Duke students, and I had no real access to the outside world or any knowledge of how to market the service to the surrounding community. So that spring semester, one of the reasons I was so overwhelmed was because I was constantly trying to figure out ways to advertise and reach people so that we could get these customers signed up. And I wasted so much time doing things like trying to contact restaurants that maybe could put a little flyer up for us, or all these dumb things, neighborhood listservs, and no one wants to post about another person's company on a neighborhood listserv, things like that. And it wasn't until one of our customers, who was a grad student, said like, hey, I could post about it on our neighborhood listserv and next door for you guys. It wasn't until she did that we actually started getting customers. So I felt like I wasted a tremendous amount of time doing things that didn't work, when I should have just been thinking a little bit more big picture about like, hey, we have people who can tell other people. Let's just recruit them to spread the word instead of me trying to reach out to all these companies that I don't know. And so I think looking back, that was the biggest mistake I made, was that I wasted a lot of time trying to do all these little things. But if I had just focused on the big picture and slowed it down a little bit, I think I would have thought more clearly through what I needed to do to achieve my goal.
That's great. So let's go to some stats that you can, or some stats or qualitative description that you can brag on how you've done, like number of pounds saved, things like that. How's it gone?
Yeah. So, we have this goal to, fight food waste, and it's always a work in progress, but we'd estimate that we've rescued about 120,000 pounds of ugly and excess produce from going to waste so far, by featuring them in our boxes. Additionally, we aren't at this point working with the food insecure community. It's just something that's going to take a little bit more time, but in the meantime, we're still committed to doing what we can to fight hunger, and we donate 2 to 5 pounds of produce for every box sold, and have donated about 46,000 pounds this year to some of the local food pantries in the Triangle area. So that's really been great as well.
That's great. Do you have any other thoughts you want to share with Duke undergrads that are thinking of starting a company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess I tell this to some of my friends who have startups who are younger than me. I definitely feel fortunate to have started my company at the right time. Now, it's more hands-on than maybe another startup that's tech-based and they can sit at a computer for most of the day. But that being said, I had this idea, and it wasn't until senior year that I had to start working on it for realsies. And by senior year, I kind of stopped caring a little bit and just had less demands by second semester, so I could afford to not pay as much attention in class and do things that I needed to do to help the business. But so I was very lucky to start it at that time. I don't know how I would have made it through 3 years of Duke actually running the business. I don't think I could have done that. But for people who are younger and maybe starting a business and they're sophomores or whatever, make sure that you are still doing other things, whether it's joining a Greek organization or SLG, or doing theater or whatever. Just make sure you have a couple other outlets, because I was lucky to be so sort of entrenched in my sorority at that point that it wasn't like me getting busy with the business was going to make me drop it or something like that. But I do know other people who have contemplated leaving their other organizations so that they'd have more time to focus on their business. And then when you get really stressed out, it can become very isolating. So to have these other networks of people can be really great, so that you can, remove yourself from the stress and have people to support you. So you can just, be a college student again. And that's really important.
That's great. The other thing I want to give you the opportunity to do is to tell a few stories, and you don't have to tell them all at once here, but I'm thinking that we can identify a few stories of interesting things that you've experienced running this company, whether it's, you went to deliver something and it ended up, just not working out for whatever reason, or working out in a funny way, or again, kind of going to the purchasing of vegetables or produce from a farm stand, and some of the crazier situations that you've ended up in. Hopefully, all of them, ones that resolved well and things like that. But just an opportunity for you for us to capture some of those stories here.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been in a lot of weird situations. I can't even remember a lot of them, but one thing that always makes me chuckle a little bit is, here are two, back when me and my business partner were, doing senior year, here are two girls who from the Northeast, and, going out to rural farms, and one carries a fancy designer bag, and just it all looks out of part, and we're stepping onto these farms, and it's just The Simple Life with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie. That's sort of how I felt like we were. It was just, very, very two worlds, very different worlds colliding in those situations. And there are times, and there have been times throughout this process where I can tell that a farmer who maybe is from, rural part of North Carolina, male, tends to be older, is not taking me seriously at all because I'm a young female. Maybe they think this is just a college project or whatever. But I've been in situations where people won't take their hands out from behind my back to shake my hand and give me a business card. Or I'm at a grower buyer meetup with, where you're literally assigned a speed dating style to talk to a farmer for 5 minutes. And I said, I would really like to work with you guys. And the farmer said, well, how about you talk to my parents who work the farm stand? And I'm like, no, I would like to talk to you, the farmer, and I'm the buyer. There have been times where I definitely felt that, I'm treated a little differently being a young female in this particular industry. But there are times where I definitely own it and think it's kind of funny to kind of stand out like a sore thumb in this space. So other times, I mean, I locked myself in a freezer once. That was scary. Just, I'm just always doing weird things. People are always noticing like, oh, this little girl is lifting thousands of pounds of boxes and, whatever. I think those types of things, while I feel silly, it gives me respect.
Talk a little bit about some of the changes that you've made with respect to how people sign up. So like, I think that early on, it was like people signed up and you were kind of like billing them manually. And then if they wanted to cancel a box, they had to email you and whatnot. And so, I'm sure it was very hectic, but you've kind of changed that and smoothed it out to some degree. Just talk a little bit about how that's worked.
Well, just in general, once I graduated, things became scrappy as hell. I mean, it's growing. I was running things by myself now. People were starting to sign up and telling their friends. And that first summer, we grew a lot. And it was incredibly demanding for me to be the one who had to pick up all the produce, place the orders, go meet farmers, pack it myself, deliver it myself. It was all exhausting. And on top of that, I was handling customer service myself. We had just like a little, very premature sort of WordPress website. So the only way we could take signups was to link a Google form. So I would just keep an eye out for when people signed up, and then I would have to import all that information myself onto various spreadsheets that we had that we would use to make deliveries. And then I'd add them to our billing system that sort of was like a PayPal thing. And so the bills went out automatically, but I'd have to email all our customers each week and be like, hey, let me know if you need to skip by so-and-so date so that you don't get charged. And it was a lot. And between the operations and managing customer service all by myself, I still had only like 10% of my time available to focus on like growing the business. So needless to say, it wasn't going to grow. And I felt I was spread too thin. And so I sort of entered this period last fall where I just went into maintenance mode. Like, I'm just going to make my customers happy and accept that maybe I'm not going to grow the business right now. And sort of a wonderful thing happened. And actually at demo days last year, I wound up meeting a person who became my first major investor. And it was at first shocking to find out that someone wanted to put real money in a company, very flattering, but it made me realize, oh crap, I have to keep doing this, for a while, and overcome these scaling challenges I felt I couldn't, handle. But kind of once it sunk in and I realized what I could do with this money to grow the company and develop the infrastructure we needed to scale, I was like, oh, I can do this. So I set out for a few months in like the winter and early spring, doing the things that I felt were necessary for our growth. The first being hiring an operations manager who could handle buying the produce and all the supply chain stuff, so that I didn't have to handle anything produce related anymore. And the second major thing was developing an actual e-commerce site. So we worked with a company that develops subscription platforms for like food delivery services to build our website, and that launched in June. And so since then, customers can just sign up directly on our website. Billing occurs through the site. They can manage their subscriptions through the site. It doesn't require any of my assistance anymore. So that has freed up a lot of our time, and it helps to automate a lot of our other processes like direct communications and logistics. So that has decreased, the time I have to spend doing those tasks. So that's been really great. And, the customers who've been with us since the beginning, we had to sort of work through some challenges with the site launch together, and they were really patient. But a lot of them have, even acknowledged it's great to see how much the company has matured since I signed up, with the new hires and the website. And it's always really, it's really wonderful and rewarding to hear that, because I know that people are paying attention.
That's great. That's great. Last question. Talk to me a little bit about mentorship and maybe some of the best advice that you feel like you've received. We've connected you, you've connected yourself with many people for conversations, and sometimes that's turned into, mentorship and advice. What has that process been like for you? And can you just highlight a couple of favorite pieces of mentorship that have been particularly helpful for you?
Yeah. So for me, mentorship has always been a little interesting, partially because I'm one of those people who feels guilty about reaching out to anyone and asking for help. So I try to avoid doing it as much as possible. Sometimes it's a little difficult because, especially as we've grown, we've reached a stage where sometimes it's like I don't need basic information. I need someone to help me find a warehouse or whatever, you know, the problems become a lot more real. But yeah, I think throughout the process, the mentorships really come in handy when I had to do business things, because for me, you know, we're focused on delivering fresh produce and no one can tell you how to do that. And it's something I just had to learn through trial and error how to do it. And we're still learning. But I don't have a business background at all. I studied environmental science, could barely send out an email before I started this company. And there have been times though where I've had to really think like a serious business owner, and don't have the skill set necessarily to do that in the past. So having mentors has been really helpful. A few times, in particular, around the time that we were getting our investment, there was a due diligence process. And so certain mentors of mine through Duke and Melissa and Doug, as well as a mentor I have through a program called SCORE, they were really helpful during that time, helping me get my financials in order and, you know, making sure I was addressing all of the investors' questions. As I already mentioned, the startup challenge around that time where I needed a little bit of feedback on my pitch, that was, you know, mentors were really helpful then. We almost merged with the competitor, kind of the same deal, the due diligence, mentors really helpful then. And this past, you know, spring when I had to hire my first full-time employee, I had no idea how to really go about that process, especially since we weren't just hiring someone who like does marketing or sales, we were hiring someone who could buy produce and understand supply chains, and that's a little bit more niche. And you know, we needed someone with industry insight to help me through that process. So when sort of things get real, having a, you know, group of mentors in my court has been really helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Courtney. Well, we're really proud of you, and thanks for joining us today, and much continued luck with Ungraded Produce.
Thank you. All right. Have a good one.
Bye.